When Soviet forces liberated the Pingfan complex in August 1945, they found buildings filled with human remains, laboratories equipped with torture devices disguised as medical equipment, and evidence of experiments so horrific that even hardened soldiers vomited. Unit 731 had operated as Japan's most classified biological warfare program, where Dr. Shiro Ishii and his team of doctors had spent years perfecting ways to kill humans using disease, poison, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia on living subjects. The frozen landscape of Manchuria in northeastern China had seemed like an unlikely location for one of history's most horrific medical facilities. But for Dr. Shiro Ishii, the remote location was perfect for conducting research that would have been impossible anywhere else. Far from international observers and hidden behind the facade of legitimate medical research, Unit 731 became a laboratory where human beings were treated as expendable test subjects in experiments designed to perfect biological warfare. Dr. Shiro Ishii was a 44-year-old Japanese microbiologist who had graduated from Kyoto Imperial University and served as a military officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, thick black hair, and piercing eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Ishii combined scientific brilliance with complete moral emptiness. He had convinced Japan's military leadership that biological weapons could provide a decisive advantage in the war against China and the eventual conflict with Western powers. In 1936, Ishii had been granted unlimited resources and complete secrecy to establish what would officially be known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The innocuous name concealed the true purpose of the facility, developing biological weapons and testing them on human subjects to determine their effectiveness and optimal deployment methods. The Pingfan complex, located approximately 20 kilometers south of Harbin in occupied Manchuria, covered nearly 6 square kilometers and employed over 3,000 personnel. The facility included administrative buildings, laboratories, barracks, a power plant, an airfield, and a special prison designed to house what the staff euphemistically called logs, human test subjects who would be used in medical experiments until they died. Ishii's research program was divided into 8 divisions, each focusing on different aspects of biological warfare development. Division 1 conducted research on bubonic plague, cholera, and typhoid. Division 2 developed biological weapons for field deployment. Division 3 studied water purification, the unit's official cover story. Division 4 manufactured vaccines and medications for Japanese troops. Division 5 conducted training for biological warfare deployment. Division 6 developed equipment for dispersing biological agents. Division 7 specialized in frostbite research. Division 8 conducted vivisection experiments on living subjects. The victims brought to Pingfan came from various sources, but most were Chinese civilians accused of being spies, communists, or resistance fighters. Others were Russian prisoners of war, Korean independence activists, and Mongolian resistance fighters. What they all shared was that once they entered the facility, they were no longer considered human beings, but rather experimental materials to be used until they died. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato led Division 7's frostbite experiments designed to help Japanese forces fighting in cold climates understand how to treat and prevent cold weather injuries. Hisato, a 38-year-old physician with thinning black hair and a methodical approach to torture, would take prisoners outside during Manchurian winters and expose them to freezing temperatures while monitoring how quickly frostbite developed and progressed. The experiments involved strapping prisoners to posts outside in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit, then periodically checking the progression of frostbite by hitting their frozen limbs with sticks to test for the sound that indicated complete freezing. Once the limbs were frozen solid, prisoners would be brought inside and subjected to various thawing techniques, some involving scalding water, others using gradual warming, while researchers documented which methods caused the most pain and tissue damage. In Division 8, Dr. Ishii personally conducted vivisection experiments on conscious subjects. The 44-year-old commander, wearing his military uniform and surgeon's apron, would perform surgical procedures on prisoners who were strapped to tables and given only paralytic drugs that prevented movement, but left them fully conscious and able to feel pain. The goal was to study human anatomy and physiology in living subjects, observing how organs functioned under various conditions and how long subjects could survive progressively more invasive procedures. The vivisection laboratory was equipped with surgical instruments, restraint devices, and observation areas where medical students and researchers could watch the procedures. Prisoners would have their abdomens opened while alive, allowing researchers to observe the function of organs like the liver, kidneys, and intestines. Some subjects would have limbs amputated without anesthesia to study blood loss and shock. Others would have organs removed one by one to determine which were essential for immediate survival. Dr. Shiro Ishii oversaw Division 1's disease research, focusing on developing more effective strains of plague, cholera, and typhoid for use as biological weapons. Naito, a 42-year-old bacteriologist with graying hair and a scholarly appearance, would infect prisoners with various diseases and document the progression of symptoms, the effectiveness of different bacterial strains, and the optimal methods for weaponizing pathogens. The disease experiments involved injecting prisoners with live cultures of deadly bacteria, then monitoring their deterioration while taking regular blood samples and tissue biopsies to study how the diseases spread through human systems. Some prisoners would be infected with multiple diseases simultaneously to observe interactions between different pathogens. Others would be given experimental treatments to test whether Japanese forces could protect themselves while deploying biological weapons against enemy populations. One of the most horrific aspects of Unit 731's research involved experiments on pregnant women and children. Dr. Ishii believed that studying how biological agents affected different age groups and developmental stages would provide valuable data for large-scale biological warfare deployment. Pregnant prisoners would be infected with various diseases, then subjected to vivisection procedures that allowed researchers to observe how pathogens affected both mother and fetus. Children brought to the facility were subjected to the same experiments as adults, with researchers documenting how their smaller body mass and developing immune systems responded to biological agents, surgical trauma, and environmental stresses like extreme cold. The facility maintained detailed records of these experiments, treating the destruction of human life as routine data collection for military research purposes. The facility also conducted field tests of biological weapons on Chinese villages and towns in the surrounding region. Unit 731 aircraft would fly over populated areas and release bombs filled with plague-infected fleas, cholera-contaminated water, or anthrax spores, then return weeks later to document the effects on civilian populations. These attacks killed thousands of Chinese civilians while providing data on the effectiveness of different biological warfare deployment methods. Li Wei, a 34-year-old Chinese farmer with black hair and weathered hands, had been arrested by Japanese forces in 1942 on suspicion of supporting communist guerrillas operating in his region. Like thousands of other Chinese civilians, Li was transported to Pingfan and designated as experimental material for Unit 731's research program. His fate was typical of the facility's victims: systematic torture disguised as medical research conducted by doctors who had completely abandoned their ethical obligations. Li was first subjected to frostbite experiments under Dr. Yoshimura's supervision, spending hours exposed to sub-freezing temperatures while researchers documented how quickly his extremities froze and what sounds his frozen limbs made when struck with sticks. After surviving the frostbite experiments with severe tissue damage to his hands and feet, Li was transferred to Division 8 for vivisection research. In the surgical laboratory, Dr. Ishii personally conducted Li's vivisection, beginning with exploratory surgery to examine his internal organs while he was conscious and restrained. The procedure continued over several hours as Ishii removed organs one by one, documenting Li's survival time and physiological responses to progressive surgical trauma. Li remained conscious throughout most of the procedure, experiencing unimaginable pain while serving as a living anatomy lesson for Unit 731's medical staff. The facility's records, maintained with typical Japanese bureaucratic precision, documented thousands of similar cases. Prisoners were assigned numbers rather than names, and their deaths were recorded with clinical detachment as completion of experimental protocols or termination of research subject. The systematic dehumanization of victims allowed Unit 731's staff to conduct atrocities while maintaining the pretense that they were engaged in legitimate medical research. Dr. Ishii encouraged his staff to view their work as patriotic service essential for Japan's military success. He organized social events and recreational activities for Unit 731 personnel, creating a work environment where torturing human beings was normalized as routine professional duty. Many of the facility's doctors and researchers were young medical graduates who had been recruited directly from Japanese universities and trained to conduct human experimentation without questioning the ethical implications. As the war situation deteriorated for Japan in 1944 and 1945, Unit 731's research became increasingly desperate and brutal. With Soviet forces advancing toward Manchuria and American bombing intensifying throughout the Japanese Empire, Ishii accelerated his experiments in hopes of developing biological weapons that could change the course of the war. The facility's records show a dramatic increase in human experimentation during the final months of the war, as researchers worked frantically to perfect biological warfare techniques. In August 1945, as Soviet forces approached Hardened, Dr. Ishii ordered the complete destruction of Unit 731's facilities and evidence. The 44-year-old commander, realizing that the war was lost and that capture would mean exposure of his crimes, implemented a comprehensive plan to eliminate all traces of the biological warfare program. Buildings were demolished, equipment was destroyed, and the remaining prisoners were executed to prevent them from testifying about the experiments they had survived. The destruction of Pingfan was systematic and thorough. Explosives demolished the laboratory buildings, incinerators burned thousands of documents and research records, and burial parties disposed of human remains that had accumulated from years of medical experimentation. Unit 731's personnel scattered, many returning to civilian medical practice in Japan while maintaining silence about their wartime activities. When Soviet forces finally reached the abandoned Pingfan complex, they found a scene of devastation that initially concealed the true nature of what had occurred there. Demolished buildings, scattered debris, and hastily filled mass graves provided evidence of systematic destruction. but the full scope of Unit 731's crimes only became apparent through investigation of surviving documents and testimony from local Chinese witnesses who had observed the facility's operations. Soviet investigators, led by Colonel Ivan Petrov, began documenting evidence of biological warfare research and human experimentation. Petrov, a 45-year-old officer with graying hair and experience investigating Nazi atrocities in Eastern Europe, initially struggled to comprehend the scale and nature of what Unit 731 had accomplished. The systematic torture and murder of thousands of human beings conducted by medical professionals in the name of scientific research exceeded even the horrors he had witnessed in Nazi concentration camps. The Soviet investigation revealed that Unit 731 had maintained detailed records of its experiments, including photographs, medical charts, and research reports that documented the facility's activities. These materials provided overwhelming evidence that Japanese military doctors had conducted systematic human experimentation for biological warfare development, violating every principle of medical ethics and international law. However, the full extent of Unit 731's crimes would remain hidden for decades due to a secret agreement between the United States and Dr. Ishii's surviving staff. American officials, recognizing the potential value of biological warfare research data, agreed to provide immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for exclusive access to Unit 731's research findings. This deal ensured that most of Unit 731's personnel would never face justice for their crimes against humanity. General MacArthur's headquarters in occupied Japan negotiated directly with Dr. Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders, offering protection from prosecution by international war crimes tribunals in exchange for complete cooperation in sharing biological warfare research data with American military scientists. The agreement was classified at the highest levels and kept secret from Allied governments, Soviet investigators, and the Chinese victims who had suffered at Unit 731's hands. Dr. Ishii, despite being responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people, was allowed to return to civilian life in Japan. The 44-year-old war criminal became a respected member of Japanese medical community, operating a private clinic and maintaining social relationships with former colleagues who had participated in Unit 731's experiments. Until his death in 1959, Ishii never faced prosecution for his role in orchestrating one of history's most systematic programs of medical torture and murder. The biological warfare research data acquired from Unit 731 was integrated into American military programs, including the development of biological weapons and defensive measures against biological attacks. The knowledge gained from human experimentation conducted without consent or anesthesia influenced American biological warfare research for decades, though the source of this information remained classified to avoid acknowledging the crimes that had produced it. Many of Unit 731's personnel returned to prominent positions in Japanese academia and medicine after the war. Dr. Naito Ryoichi became president of the Japan Medical Association. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato continued his research on cold weather medicine at Japanese universities. Other former Unit 731 staff members established successful medical practices, conducted legitimate research, and trained new generations of Japanese doctors, never acknowledging their participation in wartime atrocities. The Chinese government, despite losing thousands of citizens to Unit 731's experiments, was never informed about the American Immunity Agreement and continued demanding justice for the victims of biological warfare research. Chinese investigations into Unit 731's activities were hampered by the destruction of evidence and the protection provided to Japanese personnel by American authorities, preventing accountability for crimes that had devastated entire communities. It would take decades for the full truth about Unit 731 to emerge through historical research, survivor testimony, and the gradual declassification of American documents related to the immunity agreements. Scholars and investigators working in the 1980s and 1990s finally revealed the scope of Unit 731's crimes and the extent to which American officials had protected war criminals in exchange for scientific data derived from human experimentation. The legacy of Unit 731 continues to influence international debates about medical ethics, biological warfare, and the prosecution of war crimes. The facility's systematic transformation of medical research into torture and murder demonstrated how easily scientific institutions can be corrupted when operating without ethical oversight or legal accountability. The American decision to provide immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for research data established a precedent that prioritized military advantage over justice for victims of war crimes. Today, the site of the former Ping Fan complex houses a museum dedicated to documenting Unit 731's crimes and preserving the memory of its victims. The museum displays artifacts recovered from the facility, testimony from survivors and witnesses, and historical documentation that reveals the true nature of Japan's biological warfare program. Visitors can see the foundations of laboratory buildings where thousands of people were tortured and killed in the name of medical research. The museum serves as a reminder that the systematic dehumanization of test subjects, the abandonment of medical ethics, and the prioritization of military objectives over human life can transform healing institutions into instruments of terror and death. Unit 731's legacy demonstrates how quickly medical professionals can become perpetrators of atrocities when operating without ethical constraints or legal accountability. The victims of Unit 731, Chinese farmers like Li Wei, Russian prisoners of war, Korean independence activists, and thousands of others whose names and stories were lost when their records were destroyed, deserve to be remembered not as logs or experimental materials, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a medical system that had abandoned its fundamental commitment to protecting human life and dignity. Their suffering serves as a permanent warning about the potential for scientific research to be corrupted by political objectives and military ambitions, and the crucial importance of maintaining ethical standards even in times of war and national emergency.